I hosted a survey about video games, the industry, and issues of harassment and representation in gaming. I asked questions like, do you consider yourself a gamer? Have you ever experienced harassment on the basis of your gender, sexuality, or race? And are you satisfied with the current ratio of men to women in the gaming industry? I posted this survey on Twitter, and within one day, I got over 100 responses. It's worth noting that since I posted this on my own Twitter, a significant amount of the people responding will inevitably be people who watch my videos or who follow me on Twitter. And so this isn't going to be so much of a comprehensive political analysis of everyone in the entire gaming culture, but it is a small sliver of the people who watch my videos in particular. The ultimate goal with the survey was to gauge how aware regular gaming folks are of the male-dominated culture surrounding games, as well as how they feel about that culture, as well as their position within it. I also figured that I would allow people a chance to elaborate on some of their answers so that I could gain some insight into their perspectives, and also allow the answers to perhaps point to some ideas that I hadn't thought of beforehand. So, first off, some of the statistics. Out of 100 people, 63 were men, 23 were women, and 14 were non-binary. 61% of respondents said that they played games daily or almost daily, with an additional 25% saying they played at least once a week. The most popular genres among the respondents were shooters and action games, with 72% of the respondents saying they play action games, with 66% of respondents saying they play RPGs, and 51% saying they played indie games, which I also included the phrase walking simulators for good measure. The least popular genres were puzzle games at 30% and racing games at 12%. 61% of respondents said they do not identify as gamers, while 39% said they do identify as gamers. 80% of respondents said that they want to see more women in video games, while 88% said that they want to see more women in the gaming industry. Less than 20% of respondents said that they were fine with the current representation in games or the industry, while only 2 respondents argued that there should be more men in either. How often respondents would play online is split about 50-50 between people who play regularly and people who play only once a month or less. 69% of respondents said that they haven't been harassed because of their gender, sexuality, or race. 17% said that they were harassed for their gender, 17% said harassed for sexuality, and 7% said harassed for race. 50% said that they feel like they would be harassed more if they were a different gender, race, or sexuality than they are now. So then what does this data suggest? Well, first off, the gender stats as of 2016 in gaming are estimated to be about 41% women, while the gender stats in my survey show 23% women and 14% non-binary, adding up to about 37% of people in my survey who were not men. Not to lump non-binary people and women together, but for the sake of gender dominance, my survey is close to accurate to the statistics I've found, but still slanted in favor of men compared to the average. So it's important to note that this isn't going to be a wholly representative sample, but still is going to be similar enough to the big picture of the gender demographics of gaming. When it comes to what genres they play most, I decided to incorporate a few different genres, and particularly I wanted to incorporate genres that I expected would have a gender slant, such as shooters and action games, which I expected to be played mostly by men, and puzzle games, which I expected to be played mostly by women. The statistics in the Quantic Foundry article Beyond 50/50, breaking down the percentage of female gamers by genre, show that the genres that have the most women in them tend to be puzzle games, family/farming simulators, and atmospheric exploration, which, for the sake of my survey, would probably fit under the walking simulator label that I used. The least played genres for women in the Quantic Foundry article are shooters, sports, and racing games, which is expected. My results were fairly similar, with women being more likely to answer indie games/walking simulators and puzzle games, while men were more likely to answer racing/sports games or shooters/action games. Interesting to note that racing and sports games were much lower than shooters and action games, even though both tend to see a lot more men. My best guess for the difference is that the kinds of men who typically play racing and sports games are different from the demographic of my audience. Given that there's a sort of jock undertone to these genres, I'd imagine that these games do better with particularly men who are big on sports and racing already, which I imagine are people who aren't as actively involved in gaming culture. Noticeably, puzzle games were the second lowest in terms of popularity, which are also the most successful with women in general. Looking through people's responses, I found a lot more women mentioning puzzle games as something they play often versus men. My data, of course, will be different from other surveys in small ways, but looking through the stats, I do believe that the responses are relatively the same as other data on the matter. Given that men form the largest bulk of my respondents, it's entirely expected that shooters and action games would be particularly high, and puzzle games particularly low. Now, interestingly, even though 61% of respondents said they play games almost daily, 61% of respondents also said that they would not classify themselves as gamers. Those who answered that they do identify as gamers typically had very mundane answers, such as, I play games, therefore I am a gamer. Meanwhile, the answers for why people don't identify as a gamer are very relevant. Repeatedly, people brought up not wanting to be defined by a hobby, negative connotations, disassociating with gamer culture, and specifically people mentioned harassment a number of times. Even people who answered yes often tried to clarify a disassociation with negative aspects of gaming culture. I saw in relatively similar proportion both men and women describe themselves as gamers or refuse the label. So it's not like all men consider themselves gamers while all men don't. But the very open reference to stigma on the part of both men and women, both gamers and people who reject the label, shows that to adopt the label, there is some level of a cultural issue to that has to be reconciled in order to be comfortable with said label. When I asked my respondents how they feel about gender representation in video games, they by and large agreed that we need more women characters in games. A lot of people mentioned equality. Some mentioned that it would improve the games. Some mentioned that we specifically need better written women characters. A few people mentioned that women need to stop being sexualized or marketed to men in games. And a very common response I saw was to include more women of color, more trans women, and more non-binary people. One particular person mentioned that games with female protagonists are so uncommon that Steam had to add a tag explicitly specifying that a game had a female protagonist, and I thought that observation was worth noting. Keep in mind that most of the respondents were men, so what this tells me is that the demand for changes to gaming to incorporate more women is not just held by a small group of feminist women, it's held by a lot of gaming fans in general. Similarly, most respondents agreed that more women need to be involved in developing games. The reasoning was similar. More women means more diversity, which means more kinds of games, which means the medium improves because of a variety of options available to players. Some people mentioned issues of women being barred from the industry due to prejudice or harassment. One particularly enthusiastic respondent said, and I quote, "kill all men." And that's, well, alright then. What I find interesting is the reasoning why people disagreed with the option of more women in the gaming industry. Instead of commenting on that now, I'm going to read a comment that I feel represents the contrary opinion, and then elaborate on this comment later on. Here's the comment. We can't just sit here and pretend that the employee's gender is due solely to something like sexism. Gaming is a predominantly male hobby, and as such, I believe it makes sense that the development industry is male-dominated. I could give a fucking shit who's making the game as long as it's good. Man, woman, non-binary, I could care less. Just make a good game. If women aren't interested in game development at the same percentages of males, then don't try and cry sexism in the workplace when it's literally just that the majority of females don't want to work in that field. When it comes to questions about harassment, the responses were mostly that they don't experience harassment. But I noticed a lot of the time when people said they haven't experienced harassment for their gender, race, or sexuality, they specifically made it clear that it was a conditional statement. People mentioned that they were in the closet about their gender or sexuality, others mentioned they simply don't play games online, others mentioned avoiding playing online games with strangers, refusing to use voice chat, or mentioning that they had heard others being harassed for their gender, sexuality, or race. Among those who were harassed, it was often on the basis of gender, with particularly women, both cis and trans, talking about facing harassment, though there were also some instances of people talking about being harassed for being Asian or black. I won't share any specific stories from respondents, though some people did share stories, and some of them were heartbreaking, so my heart goes out to the people who have been affected by this stuff. The broader picture that my survey suggests is that more men play games in general. More men play specific genres while more women play other genres. People of any gender would generally like to see better gender representation in gaming and in the industry. Most players would prefer not to be called a gamer because of negative connotations. And gender-based, sexuality-based, and race-based harassment is a one-way street with regards to who is being affected. What this means is that simultaneously, the industry, the audience, and thus the culture as a whole is a male-dominated space. But also that just because it is a male-dominated space doesn't mean that people by and large prefer it that way. Certainly, some do. I don't think it'd be possible to be a male-dominated space if everyone in the gaming culture wants it not to be. But the important thing to recognize is that very few people vocally said that they preferred the space to be male-dominated. Most people said they'd prefer more women in gaming, and those who didn't often said that the male-dominated space is circumstantial rather than preferable. In other words, that gaming just so happens to attract more men, rather than that the culture is in any way better off because it attracts more men. Gaming culture is not isolated. It's a subculture, meaning that it is a product of the mainstream cultural values that we have as a society, especially in America. Gaming culture does not actually need to have a majority of participants preferring male dominance for male dominance to take effect. The mainstream culture we live in is one that privileges men and subordinates everyone else. Before we even enter the culture of gaming, we are in part products of the bigger culture in our society. And so we bring that into gaming culture, such that the privileging of men at the expense of everyone else in gaming is both reflective of and tied into the bigger issue of a patriarchal society. The reason why I say this is because the privileged perspective of men, especially in a male-dominated space, permeates the culture and always has consequences for people who lack that privilege. This also means that men both define and control what games, the industry, and the culture can be and should be. It also means that any participant, no matter our gender or sexuality or race, will view gaming to some degree through male-dominated terms. For some of us, this means recognizing the dismal place that marginalized voices have in gaming culture, but also means that we do, in some ways, unconsciously maintain aspects of the male-dominated lens through which we're forced to engage with the culture. Let me get back to that quote. This respondent particularly noted that the space is male-dominated. I never mentioned male-dominated anywhere in the survey, though it may have been implicitly noticeable through the questions I did ask. This respondent argues that it's okay that it's male-dominated because women either aren't good enough or simply don't care. The rest of my statistics suggest that a large percentage of gaming fans, regardless of gender, disagree. But the respondent said, and I quote, "Just make a good game." In a later segment of this series, I'm going to touch on this idea because, as I said before and as I'll expand upon, what makes a game good already has implications about the way in which gaming fans view games and the associated culture through a male-dominated lens. In part 2, I already mentioned several excerpts from academic papers that detail the nature of male domination in cultural spaces, particularly within industries, and how this notion that the current social order within industries is somehow better or more natural is a myth. Gendered organization theory puts forth that organizations are set up to maintain male dominance in a de facto sense, though maybe not always in an intentional sense, and the day-to-day interactions of people with systems and with industries leads to the continued maintenance of male dominance. Part 2 incorporates a lot of relevant quotes which I won't repeat here, but I will add in another quote from Gender as a Social Structure. Even when women and men with feminist identities work in organizations with formally gender-neutral rules, gender inequality is reproduced during everyday interaction. The cultural expectations attached to our sex category, simply being identified as a woman or man, has remained relatively impervious to the feminist forces that have problematized sexist socialization practices and legal discrimination. The reason why it is that game fans can, by and large, agree that the industry and games themselves could do with more and better representation of women, while the industry continues to be relatively stagnant with regards to recognizing women's potential as both employees and consumers, is because the constructed default position of the industry is one of male dominance, and people unknowingly default to patriarchal assumptions about games and the industry that continue to privilege men at the expense of women, both as players and as developers. In part 4, I'll talk much more about exactly how this happens.